Imagine being betrayed by your own brothers, thrown into a pit, sold as a slave, falsely accused, forgotten in prison. And yet, the same man who was once left to die would one day stand before the most powerful ruler in Egypt. His name was Joseph. And this is the story of how God turned a 17-year-old boy's darkest nightmare into a destiny no one could have imagined. Joseph was 17 years old when his life began to change. He was the son of Jacob, a man whose family carried a promise from God, but Joseph was different from his brothers. Jacob loved Joseph deeply, and he made that love obvious. Jacob gave Joseph a special robe, a beautiful garment that made him stand out from the rest of his brothers. To Joseph, it may have been a gift, but to his brothers, it became a symbol that Joseph was favored. And jealousy began to grow. Then one night, Joseph had a dream. He saw himself and his brothers binding sheaves of grain in a field. Suddenly, Joseph's sheaf stood upright, and the sheaves of his brothers gathered around it and bowed down. Joseph told his brothers about the dream, and they hated him even more. "Do you really think you will rule over us?" Their anger grew. But Joseph had another dream. This time, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to him. Even his father was disturbed by the dream, but Jacob remembered it. Joseph had no idea what those dreams meant. He only knew what he had seen. And what he didn't know was that those dreams would eventually become reality. But before Joseph would ever reach the palace, he would first have to descend into a pit. One day, Joseph's brothers were far away tending their father's flocks. Jacob sent Joseph to find them. Joseph went looking for his brothers. He didn't know that he was walking toward the greatest betrayal of his life. When his brothers saw him coming from a distance, they recognized him immediately, and they began to plot. Here comes the dreamer. They didn't see their brother. They saw the person they hated, the one who had dreams about ruling over them, the one who reminded them of their father's favoritism. And then they made a terrifying decision. They would kill him. But Reuben, Joseph's oldest brother, tried to stop them. Instead of killing Joseph immediately, they threw him into an empty pit. Imagine the fear. Joseph looked up. His brothers stood above him. The same brothers he had grown up with. The same brothers he trusted. And now they had abandoned him in a pit. Joseph cried out. He pleaded with them, but they didn't listen. Then something even worse happened. A caravan appeared in the distance. Traders were traveling toward Egypt. And Joseph's brothers saw an opportunity. Instead of killing Joseph, they sold him. Joseph was pulled out of the pit, but he wasn't rescued. He was sold as a slave. The brothers watched as Joseph was taken away. The 17-year-old boy who once dreamed of greatness was now being dragged toward a foreign land. He had no idea where he was going, no idea what would happen to him, and no idea if he would ever see his family again. Joseph had lost everything: his father, his home, his freedom, his family, and his future. But God had not lost Joseph. Joseph was taken to Egypt. There, he was purchased by a powerful Egyptian official named Potiphar. Joseph had every reason to become bitter. He could have said, "God has forgotten me. My brothers destroyed my life. There is no future for me." But Joseph didn't give up. He worked, and he worked faithfully. Potiphar began to notice something. Everything Joseph touched seemed to prosper. Joseph was trustworthy. Joseph was disciplined. Joseph was faithful. And eventually, Potiphar placed Joseph in charge of his entire household. The slave had become a trusted servant. It looked like Joseph's life was finally turning around. But then another test came. Potiphar's wife noticed Joseph. She tried to tempt him, but Joseph refused. He understood that giving in would be a sin against God. He chose faithfulness over pleasure, and that decision would cost him everything. When Joseph refused her, she became angry. She accused Joseph of doing something he had never done. Her accusation was believed. Joseph was arrested, and once again, Joseph was thrown away. First, a pit. Now, a prison. He had done nothing wrong. Yet he was suffering. Joseph had obeyed God. And somehow his life seemed to become even worse. But sometimes the road to God's purpose passes through places we never expected. And Joseph was about to discover that prison would become the doorway to the palace. Joseph was placed in prison. But even there, Joseph did not become useless. He served. He worked. He helped others. And the Lord was with him. The prison commander noticed Joseph's character. Joseph was eventually trusted with responsibility over the other prisoners. Then one day, two important prisoners arrived. They had served Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. One was Pharaoh's cupbearer. The other was Pharaoh's baker. One morning, Joseph noticed that both men looked troubled. Joseph asked them what was wrong. They had both dreamed dreams, but they didn't know what the dreams meant. Joseph told them that interpretations belonged to God. Then he listened. The cupbearer told Joseph his dream. Joseph explained that in 3 days, Pharaoh would restore him to his position. Then Joseph made a request. When the cupbearer returned to Pharaoh, Joseph asked him to remember him, to tell Pharaoh about him, to help him escape from prison. 3 days later, everything happened exactly as Joseph said. The cupbearer was restored, but Joseph remained in prison. 1 day passed, then another, and another. The cupbearer forgot him. Joseph waited, but no one came. He had been forgotten. 2 full years passed. Then one night, Pharaoh had disturbing dreams. He saw 7 healthy cows. Then 7 thin and ugly cows appeared, and the thin cows swallowed the healthy ones. Pharaoh was troubled. He called for Egypt's wise men, but no one could explain the dreams. Then the cupbearer remembered. Joseph, the prisoner, the man who had correctly interpreted his dream. Joseph was brought before Pharaoh. Imagine the scene. A prisoner standing before the king of Egypt. Joseph had no royal clothing, no army, no position, no power. But he had something Pharaoh's wise men did not have. God had given Joseph the ability to understand the dream. Pharaoh told Joseph what he had seen. Joseph explained that the 2 dreams had one meaning. Egypt would experience 7 years of extraordinary abundance. But after those 7 years would come 7 years of terrible famine. And Joseph didn't stop there. He gave Pharaoh a plan. Egypt needed to store grain during the years of abundance so that the nation could survive the famine. Pharaoh recognized something extraordinary in Joseph. This was not merely a prisoner. This was a man with wisdom, a man who could lead, and suddenly, Joseph's life changed. The prisoner became the governor of Egypt. He was given authority over the entire land. The 17-year-old boy who had been thrown into a pit was now standing in a palace. The slave had become a ruler. The prisoner had become a leader. The forgotten man had become one of the most powerful men in Egypt. And Joseph was only 30 years old. The 7 years of abundance came. Joseph organized the collection of grain. He prepared Egypt for what was coming. Then the 7 years of famine began. The famine spread across the region. People came to Egypt looking for food. Even Joseph's family back in Canaan was affected. Jacob heard that Egypt had grain, so he sent his sons to buy food. Joseph's brothers traveled to Egypt. They entered the land searching for grain. They had no idea that the man standing before them was their brother. Joseph recognized them immediately, but they didn't recognize Joseph. Years had passed. The boy they had sold was gone. Standing before them was a powerful Egyptian ruler. And then something incredible happened. Joseph's dreams began to come true. His brothers bowed before him, exactly as he had dreamed when he was young, but Joseph didn't immediately reveal who he was. He tested them. He wanted to know whether they had changed. He questioned them. He demanded that they bring their youngest brother, Benjamin. Benjamin was Joseph's full brother, and Jacob loved him deeply. When the brothers eventually returned with Benjamin, Joseph watched them carefully. Would they abandon Benjamin the way they had abandoned Joseph? Would they sacrifice their brother to save themselves? Joseph tested them again. At this time, something was different. Judah stepped forward. He offered himself in Benjamin's place. He pleaded for his brother's life. He was willing to suffer so Benjamin could return to their father. Joseph finally knew. His brothers had changed, and Joseph could no longer control his emotions. Joseph ordered everyone else to leave the room. Then he looked at his brothers, and he revealed the truth. I am Joseph. His brothers were terrified. They couldn't speak. The man standing before them was the brother they had betrayed. The brother they had sold. The brother they thought was gone forever. Now, Joseph had the power to destroy them. They expected revenge. But Joseph gave them something they never expected: mercy. Joseph told them not to be afraid. He explained that what they had intended for evil, God had used for good. Joseph understood something his brothers could not see. Their betrayal had been real. Their actions had been evil. The pain had been real. But God had been working through the entire journey. The pit, the slavery, the false accusation, the prison, the forgotten years, the palace, the famine. All of it had brought Joseph to this moment. Not simply so Joseph could become powerful, but so that many lives could be saved. Joseph sent for his father. When Jacob heard that Joseph was alive, he could hardly believe it. The son he thought was dead. After years of grief, Jacob finally saw Joseph again. Imagine that reunion. A father embracing the son he thought he had lost forever. Joseph's family came to Egypt, and the family was preserved during the famine. The boy who had been rejected by his brothers became the one who saved them. The brother they tried to destroy became the brother who fed them. The son they sold became the man God used to preserve an entire family. But Joseph's story was not simply about becoming powerful. It was about what happened inside Joseph, while everything around him was falling apart. After Jacob died, Joseph's brothers became afraid again. They wondered, what if Joseph now takes revenge? They came before him. They were afraid, but Joseph reassured them. He understood that revenge belonged to God. Joseph had every human reason to hate them, but he chose forgiveness. He looked beyond what they had done. He looked at what God had done. The brothers had planned evil, but God had turned that evil into something that saved lives. Joseph had entered Egypt as a slave. He remained faithful through suffering. He survived betrayal. He survived temptation. He survived false accusations. He survived prison. He survived being forgotten. And eventually, God raised him up. Joseph lived to see his family restored. He lived to see his children, and he remained faithful to God until the end of his life. Joseph's story is not the story of a man who never suffered. It is the story of a man who suffered and refused to let suffering destroy his faith. He was betrayed, but he didn't become a betrayer. He was hated, but he didn't become hateful. He was tempted, but he remained faithful. He was falsely accused, but he didn't abandon God. He was forgotten, but God never forgot him. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of Joseph's life. Your pit may not be the end. Your prison may not be the end. Your waiting season may not be the end. You may not understand what God is doing right now. Joseph didn't either. When he was inside that pit, he couldn't see the palace. When he was inside the prison, he couldn't see the future. When the cupbearer forgot him, Joseph couldn't see the plan. But God could. And years later, Joseph could finally look back and understand. The road was painful. The journey was unfair. But God had never abandoned him. Joseph went from the pit to slavery, from slavery to prison, from prison to the palace, and from the palace to becoming the instrument God used to save his family. His brothers tried to bury his future, but they couldn't bury God's plan. They tried to destroy his destiny, but they couldn't destroy what God had prepared. And that is why Joseph's story still matters. Because sometimes the chapter that looks like the end is actually the beginning of the greatest chapter of your life. Joseph lost almost everything, but he never lost God. And in the end, Joseph discovered that the God who was with him in the pit was the same God who was waiting for him in the palace. This was the life of Joseph, a story of betrayal, a story of suffering, a story of faith, a story of forgiveness, and above all, a story of God's purpose.